race as it pertains to education. Maybe Aimee or Robert, could you speak a little to that too?
In terms of education and race in this country, unfortunately, what we see is pretty much students who happen to be African American and or Latino, and also if they're growing up on Native American reservations or happen to be Asian living in certain communities throughout the U.S., they often are not achieving at the same levels as their white and especially their white privileged peers. And basically those racial inequities cut across neighborhoods and also different parts of cities. And so, for example, I grew up here in Chicago on the south side of the city in Inglewood and South Shore. And the neighborhoods that I grew up in, the schools were not actually very strong. And often the schools are significantly under-resourced as well. Thanks to a lot of different lucky factors, my family actually owned a business in North Kenwood, which is a neighborhood that's actually changed an enormous amount in the last 25 to 30 years. And because of that business and honestly where it was located, their economic opportunities actually changed, and so our school situations changed over time. So I ended up at a high school in the south suburbs, where pretty much all of the African American students were tracked into remedial classes. And when my mom realized that that's what they wanted for my sister, my older sister, and myself, she would not have it. However, what that meant, and why I think this is so important to this discussion, was that my older sister and I would be one of two or maybe one of three African American students in our honors and AP classes in that suburban high school. And unfortunately, even if you look at suburban schools, you will see the racial tracking of minority students. And so in our country, what we also know is that education is often then attached to economic prospects. And the work that I now do at this organization I founded called Braven is about helping young people who happen to be first in their families to go to college or are underrepresented in the professional workforce, not only get through college, but get into the workforce. And how all this starts to play out over time is that we are now in a moment where people say, oh, we're so highly connected and everyone is so well networked. Well, actually, there's only a certain group of people who is very well networked. So in the world of Braven, as we help bridge the education to employment divide that often impacts African American, Latino, and other underrepresented folks in the professional workforce, what we realize as we talk to employers a lot is often people get hired in this country through their networks. Who do you know at a certain place? So one employer that we've been working with actually in the Bay Area, where a number of former Teach for America staff members happen to work, and a friend of mine who was on a team that I helped to lead, he basically said, look, 80% of our workforce gets referred in by current people who work here. So the group of students who I'm working with and my team is working with at Braven, they often don't know people who happen to work in that company that sits in the middle of Silicon Valley where the school is that we actually work. And so I just think it's really important to understand how race not only plays out in education, but how education is then connected to economic opportunity, and then all of a sudden we see a group and groups of people who actually have an unfair advantage at every single point of the continuum.
More about the achievement gap. That's sort of shorthand lingo to describe the difference in outcomes between different groups of students. I usually think of it in three age groups. So 4-year-olds that are raised in poverty hear 15 million fewer words than their higher income peers. And then when they start school, they often are in schools that don't give them as quite a shot at things. And so they move along at a slower pace. By the time they're in 5th grade, they're 2.5 grade levels behind. This is Chicago stats. And then by the time that they finish high school, half of the students from low-income backgrounds, almost 95% of whom are students of color, whether African American or Latino, have dropped out of high school before graduating, or if they do graduate, they're performing at the level of an 8th grader. And so you imagine the story that we tell of you need to finish high school and then you'll be able to college and that you'll be able to fulfill the American dream. It is just not true of these students. They've finished high school and they are not prepared to succeed in college. Could you give us maybe something that we might not know about the achievement gap kind of on the ground, maybe in the city of Chicago? And then what sources of hope do we have? Like, why would we think this is not just utterly hopeless? Robert, I'm going to start with you.
All right, good evening, everybody, and thanks for spending a Friday evening on our first 60-degree day, right? We're all in here. I was driving, I seen everybody in the park. I was like, man, they're at the basketball court. There's the grill right there. I mean,
We got Michael Jordan right here, man.
Okay, Jeremy. So recently there was an Atlantic article. The achievement gap, one, is predicated upon standardized tests that determine who's in the fourth quartile, third, second, and first by a bell curve. So as long as we continue to define achievement by a standardized means of assessment, which is always going to have four quartiles, there will always be an achievement gap. One. You have to take that and use that seriously, because we can take any group of so-called low-performing, under-resourced children, move them 2 or 3 grade levels ahead, and I guarantee you, like they did Tiger Woods, they will redefine the golf course because they want to make it more competitive in the name of competition. So in the Atlantic article, it said that the achievement gap is more connected to expectations. Okay, what do we expect of our children when we see them? How well have we been poisoned by our American democracy about when you see boys that look like me, what are your hopes and your fears for them? You know? And if we don't wrestle with that on a daily basis and confront it head on in little small ways, like when you go into a classroom, who sits in the front? The back of the bus isn't required seating anymore, but in classrooms, I'm sure there are probably a gang of black boys sitting in the back of the class. I'm talking about on a carpet. And if we don't interrupt that space and tell the teacher or the families who think that's an appropriate space and arrangement, the way that configuration will play out over time, from access to selective enrollment, high schools in this city to AP coursework, in other high schools, it will continue. It was said in the article Susan Gist wrote over in 1980 that many of the schools that our children participate in do not develop them to be executives. So we don't expect them to be the 30 under 30 person in Forbes. We want them to have realistic expectations. We want them to at least have a fighting chance. And so we may enter vocational schools, which are fine. I need a barber to cut this mohawk. I don't know how to do it. So that's a fine profession. I don't know how to make, certain culinary delights. That's a fine profession. I'm gonna need somebody to do that. I don't care what the race is or the ethnicity, I just want it to be of high quality. In my school, in terms of the question around hope, so what are the hopes? My personal educational experience, I had 1 out of 25 teachers, like a probability, only 1 of them was an African-American male. And that's pre-K through college. And university level, I had 1 black male, and he was of African descent, not African-American. But my likelihood of being incarcerated is a 1 out of 3 chance. Just in our fine country, we go from 3/5 to 1/3. I don't know if those odds are better or worse. I got to ask a mathematician, but they're not good odds. So in our school, a public school, we have a motto. We say, "Be the nest," and it's an acronym. And everyone kind of likes nest, right? You may think of it as a home. It's nurturing. It's kind. It's inviting. But the acronym simply says we can teach children to be neighborly, and we can teach them to stay engaged, because that's what it takes, right? To be successful, to do impress. We can teach them to be scholarly, the S. Scholars are subjected to peer review, so you get feedback. That's why we know who's a scholar and who's a blogger, right? Some people should tell some presidential candidates the difference. And the last letter, T, teamwork. I promise you, if I can inculcate my children who live in Cabrini to be neighborly, engaged, scholarly, and teamwork, other people who may know the answer to the question don't stand a chance, right? Because every employer wants to hire employees who are kind. I was over here. Anyone work at Apple store right now? I overheard someone talking. They said, I don't know much about Apple devices. And he said, they hire people who are good, have good interpersonal relationships. I was like, that makes sense, because every time I go to the Apple store, even if I'm upset about my cracked phone screen, I have a pleasant experience, right? Those are the type of people we want. And there is hope, despite the odds of me being incarcerated 1 to 3 and not having an African-American teacher. There are still things we can do, and I'm glad we're having this conversation.
Thanks, Robert. Any sources of hope when we think about education outcomes? I think of something like 90-90-90 schools. Aimee, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, in the last 20 years or so, we've watched a number of schools come about that are, without a doubt, making certain that students who happen to be growing up in low-income communities or from low-income families, like I was, have a real shot of getting a high-quality education. So we've seen all sorts of schools emerge from the charter sector, even in a city like DC, in the public school sector, as well as Catholic schools like the Cristo Rey network of charter schools as well, that are serving all kids at a really high level. And so I do think that is a source of great, great inspiration. And I would also say that some of those schools that we've watched over time be the strongest have actually also been truly a part of the neighborhood fabric, where the school is a vibrant part of the neighborhood and of the community. And so it is really wonderful to think about new schools and strong schools that can emerge in various types of communities. And I would also say the other thing that we've seen in education, in K-12 especially in the last, I'd say this has probably been more the last 7 years, 5 to 7 years, has actually been intentionally creating schools that are multiracial, that are mixed income, and I think that is really a direction that I'm at least excited about, because one thing that I would say, and this is from my own experience, there were lots of things that were highly complicated about going into a school situation where my peers had been a part of family units that were significantly more well-off than mine was. But I also learned a lot from that experience, and I also think that my peers learned a lot from me. And so I do think that is one thing that we're seeing a lot of more recently, is a real conversation of what does it look like to have integrated schools again.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. I think the next topic I have is the seriousness of human sin. And by this, we've all been in settings that might even in some sense achieve good outcomes, where test scores are improving, or you look in the room and it feels like, oh, there's an attempt at diversity here, this is exciting. But I think we've all also been in those settings and felt like we're not really getting to the root of the issue here. This is an effort that has been largely built on a common belief about the Bible and the condition of the human heart. What can we say about the challenges we're facing, and then also kind of the hope that we have through the gospel? So Joel, I'm going to bring this to you. In the Wheaton message, you talked about self-justification and the just sort of the different ways self-justification can kind of happen over and over and over. You can be in one space and self-justify, move into a new space, self-justify in a new way, and it just sort of continually happens. And in the chapel message, you asked the question, what would it take for